Jake Murphy wiped his hands on his already stained jumpsuit and stared at the clogged waste disposal unit with the kind of resignation that only comes from 3 years of maintaining alien plumbing. The Stellar Serenity might have been advertised as the galaxy's premier luxury cruise liner, but apparently nobody had told the Glorban passengers that their digestive enzymes could dissolve titanium. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, reaching for his toolkit. Around him, the gleaming corridors of the ship hummed with the gentle vibration of hyperdrive engines and the not-so-gentle complaints of entitled alien tourists. "Human! The sonic shower in Suite 847 is making the wrong frequency again." The shrill voice belonged to Kix, one of the Zentorian crew members who seemed to believe that volume was directly proportional to authority. Jake had long since stopped trying to explain that his name wasn't human, but Kix had the memory retention of a goldfish and twice the attitude. "Yeah, I'll get right on that," Jake called back, not moving from his current position, elbow-deep in alien waste management. "Right after I finish performing miracles down here." The truth was, Jake had grown oddly fond of his job aboard the Serenity, despite everything. Sure, he was treated like a particularly clever appliance by most of the crew, and yes, the passengers seemed to think he was some sort of fix-it wizard who could repair their broken gadgets with a wave of his hand. But the pay was decent, the work was never boring, and he got to see parts of the galaxy that most humans could only dream of. Plus, there was something deeply satisfying about taking apart some piece of over-engineered alien technology and figuring out that the entire problem could be solved with a paperclip and some creative swearing. "You know what your problem is, my metallic friend?" Jake asked the disposal unit as he finally freed the blockage. "You were designed by someone who clearly never had to actually use you. 17 different sensors, 43 moving parts, and a quantum flux capacitor, all to basically flush alien waste into space. Humans would have used a lever and called it a day." The unit gurgled back to life with a satisfied hum, and Jake patted its chrome housing like a proud pet owner, another victory for human practicality over alien complexity. As he packed up his tools, Jake reflected on the absurdity of his situation. Here he was, representing humanity among the stars, and his greatest achievements included unclogging toilets and explaining to a Vorthan dignitary why his luxury suite's mood lighting couldn't actually read his mind. It wasn't exactly the glorious first contact scenario he'd imagined as a kid, but it had its moments. The ship's intercom crackled to life with Captain Zelnor's pompous announcement about their current location in the perfectly safe Kepler 442 system. Jake snorted. Everything was perfectly safe until it wasn't, and in his experience, the universe had a wicked sense of humor about timing. Jake was halfway through his mental list of broken replicators when he heard the crying. Not the dramatic wailing of a Zentorian throwing a tantrum, or the mechanical keening of a malfunctioning droid, but something smaller, sadder, and distinctly organic. Following the sound through a maintenance corridor he'd thought was empty, Jake discovered its source. A small reptilian creature no bigger than a house cat, huddled next to a ventilation grate. The little being had iridescent scales that shifted from green to blue as it sobbed, and Jake immediately recognized it as one of the Saurian hatchlings traveling in the family suites. "Hey there, little guy," Jake said softly, crouching down to the creature's level. "What's got you all worked up?" The hatchling looked up with enormous amber eyes that were currently leaking what Jake hoped were tears, and not some kind of acidic secretion. In its tiny, clawed hands was a small, intricate device that looked like someone had crossed a music box with a Rubik's Cube, and then decorated it with more buttons than a spaceship control panel. "Broken," the hatchling whispered in accented standard. "My treasure song is broken." Jake gently took the device, turning it over in his hands. It was clearly some kind of musical instrument, probably a family heirloom based on the wear patterns and the detailed engravings covering every surface. When he pressed what looked like an activation button, it produced a sound like a cat being strangled by a dial-up modem. "Yikes. Yeah, that's definitely not supposed to sound like that," Jake said. "What's your name, kiddo?" "Pip," the hatchling said, wiping its snout with the back of its hand. "The treasure song was my hatching gift. It plays the songs of my ancestry, but now it only makes sadness noise." Jake had encountered enough alien cultural artifacts to know that treasure song probably meant this thing was worth more than his annual salary, but the look of heartbreak on Pip's face made that irrelevant. He'd seen other passengers and crew members walk past the crying hatchling earlier, clearly considering it someone else's problem. "Well, Pip, today's your lucky day," Jake announced with far more confidence than he felt. "I happen to be the ship's official miracle worker. Let me take a look at this thing." Pip's eyes lit up with hope that made Jake's chest tighten. "You can fix treasure songs?" But Chief Engineer Voltan said it was beyond repair. He said hatchlings should be more careful with important things. "Chief Engineer Voltan is a pompous windbag who thinks complexity equals competence," Jake said, then caught himself. "I mean, he's probably just really busy with important ship stuff. Sometimes these old devices just need a fresh perspective." The truth was, Jake had no idea how the thing worked. The internal components were like nothing he'd ever seen, with crystalline structures that seemed to pulse with their own light and circuitry that defied every principle of human electronics. But he'd learned something important during his years in space. Alien technology might look impossible, but it still followed basic principles of cause and effect. And sometimes those principles included the universal truth that percussive maintenance could work miracles. "Tell you what, Pip, why don't you show me how it's supposed to work? Maybe if I understand what it's trying to do, I can figure out what's stopping it." As Pip began explaining the treasure song's functions in the earnest, overly detailed way that only children could manage, Jake found himself genuinely invested in solving this puzzle. It wasn't his job, it wasn't going to earn him any recognition from the crew, and it was definitely going to make him late for his other repairs. But sometimes, Jake thought as he studied the impossibly complex device, the most important problems were the smallest ones. 2 hours later, Jake was pretty sure he'd accidentally invented 17 new ways to break alien technology. The treasure song had gone from sounding like a dying cat to resembling a garbage disposal eating cutlery, with brief interludes that sounded like interstellar radio static. "Okay, new plan," Jake announced to Pip, who had been watching every move with the patient fascination of a child convinced that adults possessed magical powers. "Sometimes you have to get creative with these things." Jake's definition of creative apparently involved a sonic screwdriver, 3 paper clips, a piece of chewing gum, and what he was pretty sure was either a prayer or a creative string of profanity. The treasure song's internal structure was like a 3-dimensional puzzle designed by someone who clearly enjoyed making engineers cry. "The problem is," Jake explained as he carefully realigned what looked like a crystalline tuning fork, "whoever built this thing was showing off. See this harmonic resonance chamber? It's got about 15 redundant systems that all have to be perfectly calibrated or the whole thing goes haywire." Pip nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. Grandfather always said the old makers built things to last forever and confuse enemies. "Well, mission accomplished on the confusing part," Jake muttered. He'd identified the main issue. A microscopic crack in one of the resonance crystals that was throwing off the entire harmonic matrix. The repair should have been impossible with standard tools, but Jake had learned to think outside the conventional toolbox. "Human engineering principle number 1, he told Pip as he carefully applied a thin layer of nano-bonding compound to the crack. "If you can't fix it properly, fix it creatively, and if that doesn't work, hit it with something." The nano compound was technically designed for hull repairs, not delicate musical instruments, but Jake had discovered that the stuff could bond almost anything if you convinced it to. A little heat from his plasma cutter on the lowest setting, some gentle pressure and a whispered threat to feed the device to the waste disposal if it didn't cooperate. "And now for the moment of truth," Jake said, holding his breath as he activated the treasure song. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, like sunrise after a long night, the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard began to flow from the device. It was music, but not like any human music. It told stories without words, painted pictures without colors, and somehow managed to sound like homesickness and wonder and the dreams of ancient stars all at once. Pip's entire body lit up, scales shifting through a rainbow of colors that Jake was pretty sure indicated extreme joy. The little hatchling grabbed the treasure song and hugged it to its chest, tears streaming down its scaled cheeks. "It sings," It sings the ancestry songs again. Pip bounced excitedly, then suddenly grew solemn. Jake, human, you have given me back my family's voices. How can Pip repay such kindness? The hatchling reached into a small pouch and pulled out what looked like a simple metal pendant on a chain. This is friendship token. Very old, very important. Please take. Jake started to protest that it wasn't necessary, but the earnest gratitude in Pip's eyes stopped him. He accepted the pendant with the gravity the moment deserved, tucking it into his jumpsuit pocket. You don't owe me anything, kid. Sometimes fixing things is its own reward. As Jake watched Pip scamper away, Treasure Song clutched protectively in tiny claws. He felt a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with successful engineering. He'd spent 3 years fixing machines and gadgets, but this was the first time he'd felt like he'd actually fixed something that mattered. If only he'd known that across the void of space, sensors were tracking the stellar Serenity's route, and someone very important had just detected the unique harmonic signature of a treasure song that should have been impossible to repair. Vex Blackclaw had been having what humans might generously call a bad millennium. As the self-proclaimed Raider King of the Outer Spiral, he'd built his reputation on being the kind of alien that other aliens crossed the galaxy to avoid. His ships were feared, his crew was ruthless, and his temper was legendary even by Saurian standards. But for the past 5 cycles, he'd been searching for one small thing that mattered more than all his conquests combined: his child. The bitter custody battle with his ex-mate had ended with Pip disappearing into the vast bureaucracy of the galactic foster system, and despite commanding a fleet of pirates and cutthroats, Vex had found government paperwork to be his most formidable enemy. Every lead had gone cold, every trail had ended in red tape, and every passing day had made his scales darker with frustration. Until 30 minutes ago, when his ship's passive sensors had picked up a signal that made his blood freeze and boil simultaneously. Captain, his chief navigator Crix approached with the careful deference of someone who'd seen what happened to crew members who brought bad news. We've confirmed the harmonic signature. It's definitely a Saurian treasure song, broadcasting from the luxury liner Stellar Serenity. Vex's claws extended involuntarily, leaving gouges in his command chair's armrest. He knew that particular harmonic signature because he'd memorized every note during the long, lonely nights after Pip's disappearance. It was the treasure song he'd crafted for his child's hatching ceremony, embedded with 17 generations of family history and sealed with quantum locks that made it theoretically impossible to repair if broken. Impossible, Vex growled. The treasure song was damaged beyond use. Even our best technicians couldn't repair the harmonic matrix. Crick swallowed nervously. The signal is clear, Captain. Not only is it functional, but the harmonic resonance is actually stronger than our records indicate. Someone not only repaired it, but improved it. Vex stood from his chair, his massive frame casting shadows across the bridge. At 7 feet tall with scales that shifted from black to deep crimson when he was agitated, he was an impressive figure even by Saurian standards. The various weapons, scars, and pieces of armor he'd collected over decades of raiding only added to the effect. Set course for the Stellar Serenity, he commanded, and prep the boarding parties. If someone has my child, I want to know who and why. And if they've harmed Pip. He left the threat unfinished. His crew knew what happened to beings who crossed the Raider King. As his ship, the venomous Retribution, altered course to intercept the cruise liner, Vex found himself grappling with questions that had kept him awake for cycles. Who had Pip? Were they treating his child well? And most importantly, who possessed the skill to repair a treasure song that his own master craftsman had declared beyond salvation? The answers, he suspected, were going to be very interesting indeed. 20 minutes later, the Stellar Serenity's passengers got their first taste of excitement when several very large, very heavily armed ships appeared on their sensors. The cruise liner's captain immediately began broadcasting surrender signals and offering complimentary spa packages to the boarding parties. Vex barely noticed the ship's pathetic surrender as he led his boarding team through the airlocks. He had more important things on his mind than terrorizing tourists. He was following the treasure song signal, which was growing stronger with every step, and preparing himself for a reunion that was 5 cycles overdue. The signal led him through gleaming corridors filled with cowering passengers and toward what appeared to be crew quarters. But as he got closer, Vex's enhanced hearing picked up something that made his heart skip. The sound of his child's laughter, mixed with an unfamiliar voice speaking in heavily accented Saurian. And that's how you calibrate a sonic shower to play music instead of just cleaning. Probably shouldn't tell the other passengers about that trick, though. Vex rounded the corner and froze. There was Pip, healthy and apparently happy, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to a human in a maintenance jumpsuit. Between them sat the treasure song, glowing with perfect harmonic resonance. The human looked up as Vex's shadow fell across them, and Vex found himself staring into the most unimpressed eyes he'd encountered in decades of intimidating lesser beings. "Let me guess," the human said dryly. "You're here about the extended warranty?" Jake had dealt with difficult customers before, but none of them had been 7-foot-tall reptilian pirates with enough weaponry to outfit a small army. The alien standing in the corridor looked like someone had crossed a dragon with a nightmare and given it anger management issues. "Pip," the creature said in a voice like grinding stone, and Jake felt the little hatchling beside him go very, very still. "Father Vex," Pip whispered, and suddenly Jake understood why the kid had been so heartbroken about the treasure song. This wasn't just any broken toy. It was a connection to family that had been severed, possibly forever. "Right," Jake said, slowly getting to his feet with his hands clearly visible. "So you're the dad." "I'm Jake, ship's maintenance engineer. I fixed Pip's music box thing." Vex's massive head tilted, studying Jake with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "You repaired the treasure song?" "Yeah. Took a couple hours, but I got it working again. Kid was pretty upset about it being broken." Jake tried to keep his voice casual, but he was acutely aware that every other sound in the corridor had stopped. Apparently, the other passengers had the good sense to make themselves scarce when heavily armed space pirates showed up. "The treasure song cannot be repaired," Vex stated flatly. "It was designed with quantum locks. When damaged, the harmonic matrix becomes unstable and irreversible." Jake shrugged. "Well, somebody forgot to tell the harmonic matrix that. Look, I don't know anything about quantum locks or whatever, but I do know that when something's broken, you figure out why it's broken and you fix it. Everything else is just overcomplicated alien engineering." Behind Vex, several other large armed aliens had appeared, all staring at Jake with expressions ranging from amazement to suspicion. Jake was getting the distinct impression that he'd accidentally done something significant, though he wasn't sure what. "Show me," Vex commanded, gesturing to the treasure song. Jake looked down at Pip, who nodded encouragingly. "It's okay, Jake human. Father Vex needs to see." So Jake found himself giving an impromptu engineering lecture to a crew of space pirates, explaining how he'd identified the crystalline fracture, improvised a bonding solution, and recalibrated the harmonic resonance chamber, using principles that apparently didn't exist in alien textbooks. "The whole thing was over-designed," Jake concluded. "You had 17 different fail-safes that were all trying to compensate for each other. I just bypassed 12 of them and told the other 5 to stop being dramatic." Vex was staring at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "You told the quantum matrix to stop being dramatic." "Well, not in those words, but essentially, yeah. Sometimes the best solution is the simple one." One of Vex's crew members, a slightly smaller saurian with intricate tattoos, stepped forward. "Captain, with respect, this human has accomplished something our master technicians declared impossible. Perhaps we should test his abilities further." And that's how Jake found himself being presented with a series of increasingly complex broken devices, each one supposedly beyond repair according to conventional wisdom. A plasma regulator that had been fried by an ion storm, a navigation computer with corrupted quantum cores, a weapon that had been damaged in battle and declared irreparable by 3 different engineering guilds. Jake fixed them all, not because he understood the alien technology better than the aliens did, but because he approached each problem with human pragmatism. Identify what's actually broken, ignore everything that's unnecessarily complicated, and apply the simplest solution that actually works. "Your plasma regulator wasn't broken," he explained as the device hummed back to life. "It was just having an identity crisis because someone programmed it to think it was supposed to be 17 different things at once." I convinced it to be a plasma regulator and let everything else sort itself out. Vex's crew was staring at Jake like he'd just performed magic, but Vex himself seemed more thoughtful than amazed. "Human," he said finally. "What is your name?" "Jake Murphy. And before you ask, no, I don't have any special training in alien technology. I just fix things for a living." "Jake Murphy," Vex repeated slowly, as if testing the name. "You have shown kindness to my child and demonstrated abilities that surpass my finest engineers. You treat Pip well?" Jake glanced down at the little hatchling who was watching the exchange with bright, hopeful eyes. "Pip's a good kid. Smart, curious, polite. Better company than most of the passengers on this tub, if I'm being honest." Something in Vex's expression shifted, and Jake realized he'd just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. 20 minutes later, Jake found himself in the surreal position of mediating a family dispute between a space pirate and his estranged child, while sitting in the Stellar Serenity's main lounge. The other passengers had been relocated to their quarters, for their safety, though Jake suspected it had more to do with giving the Raider King privacy for his family reunion. "So let me get this straight," Jake said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You two had a fight about Pip's education. It escalated into a custody battle. Pip got shuffled into the foster system, and you've been searching the galaxy ever since?" Vex's scales had shifted from intimidating black to a more subdued dark green, which Jake was learning meant the big alien was feeling guilty. "The magistrate said I was an unfit parent because of my profession, that a raider's ship was no place for a hatchling. But I want to learn about ships and fixing things and adventures," Pip protested from where the little hatchling was curled up between Jake and Vex. "The foster family was nice, but they only wanted me to study law and accounting." Jake looked back and forth between them, seeing the obvious affection despite the tension. "You know, where I come from, we have a saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Pip here spent 2 hours watching me repair that treasure song, asked intelligent questions and never once got bored or impatient. That's not exactly typical accountant behavior." Vex's massive head turned toward Jake. "You think Pip has engineering aptitude?" "I think Pip has your stubborn streak and a natural talent for understanding how things work. That's a pretty good foundation for either engineering or piracy, depending on which direction you want to go." For the first time since the reunion began, Vex actually smiled, showing teeth that could probably bite through starship hull plating. "My chief engineer has been asking for an apprentice, someone young enough to learn proper technique instead of bad habits. And I bet Pip could teach your crew a thing or two about human problem-solving approaches," Jake added. "Kid's got good instincts." Pip's scales had shifted to bright gold, which Jake was pretty sure meant extreme happiness. "Father Vex, can Jake Human come too? He knows so many interesting ways to fix things." Jake started to protest that he had a job and responsibilities, but Vex was already nodding thoughtfully. "Chief Engineer Murphy does have a certain effectiveness quiz that my current crew lacks, and Pip clearly trusts you, which is no small thing." "Chief Engineer Murphy?" Jake repeated. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm just a maintenance guy on a cruise ship." "We're just a maintenance guy," Vex corrected. "Now you're chief engineer of the most feared raider fleet in the outer spiral. The position comes with excellent benefits, hazard pay, and the opportunity to solve more interesting problems than clogged alien toilets." Jake looked around the lounge, considering his options. On one hand, he had a stable, predictable job keeping rich aliens comfortable. On the other hand, he had the chance to work with technology that would challenge him, help raise a kid who clearly needed both technical guidance and emotional support, and apparently earn the respect of beings who measured competence in terms of actual results rather than official credentials. "Do I get business cards?" he asked finally. Vex's laugh was like controlled thunder. "Whatever you want them to say." 6 months later, Jake's new business cards read, Chief Engineer and Galactic Problem Solver, though most of the crew just called him the human who fixes everything. Pip had indeed proven to be a natural engineer, with an intuitive understanding of both human and alien approaches to technology that made for some genuinely innovative solutions. The treasure song sat in a place of honor in Pip's quarters aboard Vex's flagship, playing the ancestral melodies that connected the little hatchling to generations of family history. But more important than the repaired heirloom was the repaired relationship between parent and child, built on mutual respect and shared adventures among the stars. And Jake had learned something important about the nature of fixing things. Sometimes the most broken situations were also the most worth repairing. Sometimes all it took was someone willing to ignore the conventional wisdom about what was impossible and apply a little creative problem solving to find a solution that actually worked, even if that solution occasionally involved being adopted by space pirates and becoming the most unlikely chief engineer in galactic history. But that, as Jake often reflected while watching Pip practice advanced engineering techniques, was just another day in paradise.